Did you know that the tea bag, the ballpoint pen, and the slinky all have their roots in a global conflict? Or that the idea of a teenager didn't really exist before the 1940s? We think of war as something that happens over there on battlefields with soldiers and tanks. But the Second World War wasn't just a series of battles. It was a total war. It reached into every kitchen, every factory, and every home. It changed how people ate, what they wore, how they talked, and even how they thought. It took the world as it was, shook it violently for 6 years, and set it down as something completely new. How could a global conflict dictate the color of your lipstick? Why did the government suddenly want the fat from your frying pan? And what does a top secret code breaking operation have to do with the computer on your desk today? The answers are woven into the fabric of our daily lives in ways we rarely ever stop to notice. Number 25. What happens when the government controls your closet? Before the war, fashion was a world of excess for those who could afford it. Styles changed with the season. Pleats, ruffles, and long flowing skirts were common. Men's suits had double-breasted jackets, wide lapels, and extra trousers. It was all about showcasing fabric and flair. Then, everything changed. The war effort needed vast amounts of material. In wool for uniforms, silk and nylon for parachutes, leather for boots. Civilian life had to adapt, and it had to do so drastically. The government stepped in. In countries like the United States and Britain, they introduced strict regulations on clothing manufacturing. This wasn't a suggestion, it was the law. The goal was simple: conserve every possible inch of fabric. In Britain, the utility clothing scheme was introduced in 1941. It was overseen by the Board of Trade, headed by figures like Oliver Littleton. The scheme dictated everything: the number of buttons on a coat, the length of the skirt, the amount of stitching. There were to be no more pleats, no unnecessary pockets, and no embroidery. The famous CC41 label, standing for Controlled Commodity 1941, was stamped onto clothing, signifying that it met these austere standards. It became a symbol of both rationing and patriotic duty. In the United States, a similar order, L85, was issued by the War Production Board in 1942. It limited the amount of fabric that could be used in a single garment. Skirt, hems, rose. The iconic two-piece swimsuit gained popularity because it used less material than a one-piece. And men's suits became victory suits, single-breasted and without pocket flaps or vests. Even cuffs on trousers were eliminated. This wasn't about style, it was about national survival. People were encouraged to make, do, and mend. Government pamphlets and women's magazines were filled with tips on how to turn an old suit into a child's coat, or how to use fabric scraps to create new items. Darning socks became a patriotic act. The impact on daily life was immediate. Choice vanished from the stores. Everyone started to look more uniform. Style became about ingenuity rather than expense. Women drew lines down the backs of their legs with eyebrow pencils to simulate the seams of stockings, which were nearly impossible to find because nylon was needed for the war. They fashioned turbans and headscarves to cope with the difficulty of getting stylish haircuts or visiting a salon. This wasn't just about clothes, it was a constant visible reminder that the country was at war. Every time you got dressed, you were participating in the effort. It flattened social hierarchies in a way. A wealthy woman and a factory worker might both be wearing a simple, government-approved dress. The war was literally woven into the clothes on their backs, but some things still remain a mystery. How many small tailoring shops and fashion houses were driven out of business permanently by these restrictions, their skills and designs lost forever? Were there secret black markets for forbidden fabrics and pre-war styles, and how extensive were they? And how much of the make, do, and mend culture was genuine patriotic spirit versus quiet, desperate resentment at the drabness of daily life? Number 24. How did a world at war learn to talk in code? In the 1930s, everyday language was straightforward. People wrote letters, made phone calls, and read the newspaper. Slang existed, of course, but the idea that a whole new vocabulary could spring up in just a few years was unthinkable. The war changed that. It created a unique and shared experience for millions of people, and with it came a new language. It was a mix of military jargon, acronyms, and cynical humor that seeped into every corner of civilian life. Soldiers at the front developed their own shorthand. A foxhole was a hole in the ground for cover. Flak was anti-aircraft fire. These terms traveled home in letters, censored though they were, and through newsreels. But The real linguistic shift happened on the home front. Governments needed to communicate complex new ideas to the entire population. They did this through acronyms. In Britain, you had the ARP Air Raid Precautions. In the US, there was the WWII Women's Army Corps and the OPA Office of Price Administration. These weren't just letters, they were part of the daily conversation. People talked about their OPA ration books or their duties as an ARP warden. The new realities of life demanded new words. A blackout wasn't just a term for losing consciousness anymore, it was the nightly ritual of covering your windows to hide from enemy bombers. A victory garden wasn't just a vegetable patch, it was a patriotic duty. The word Jeep, which came to define the rugged military vehicle, is believed to have originated from the military designation GP for general purpose. The term snafu, a classic piece of soldier slang meaning a chaotic situation, was actually an acronym, situation, normal, all fouled up. This kind of dark acronym-based humor was a coping mechanism. The conflict also popularized words and phrases that we still use today. The term D-Day, June 6, 1944, became a generic term for any important deadline. The idea of a blockbuster bomb, a massive bomb capable of destroying an entire city block, was later co-opted by Hollywood to describe a hugely successful movie. The need for security and secrecy gave rise to phrases like loose lips sink ships, a constant reminder from propaganda posters to not discuss sensitive information. This wasn't just a slogan, it created a low-level paranoia in daily conversations. You watched what you said in the pub or on the bus. The war made language a potential weapon. It made people more conscious of their words than ever before. It's a time when a casual remark could have real consequences. But what do we still not know? How many regional slang terms from specific factories or units existed and have since been completely lost to history? Were government agencies actively testing which propaganda slogans and acronyms were most effective? And are those psychological reports still buried in an archive somewhere? And beyond the official censorship, how much self-censorship did people practice in their own letters and diaries, terrified that their true feelings of fear or despair might be discovered? Or number 23, what if the sky itself became your enemy? For most people before the late 1930s, the night sky was a source of wonder or simply a backdrop to the evening. The idea that death could rain down from it was the stuff of science fiction novels like H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. That all changed with the rise of modern air forces. Suddenly, the sky was a new front line, and every city, town, and village was a potential target. The daily life of millions was reshaped by this constant overhead threat. The most profound change was the blackout. Starting in 1939 in Britain and later implemented in coastal areas of the United States, governments ordered a complete shutdown of all external lights at night. This was a colossal undertaking. Streetlights were turned off or hooded. Car headlights were fitted with special covers that only cast a tiny sliver of light downwards. And every single household was required to ensure no light escaped from their windows. This meant heavy blackout curtains, cardboard panels, or painted panes. An air raid precautions ARP warden would patrol the streets, shouting, "Put that light out," if they saw the smallest glimmer. Life was re-engineered around the darkness. People stumbled through familiar streets that were now treacherous and alien. The number of traffic accidents soared. A simple walk home from a friend's house became a hazardous journey. Socializing in the evening was curtailed. Life contracted, pulling people indoors after sunset. The darkness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a source of profound psychological stress. It was a constant tangible reminder of the danger. The sound of the air raid siren became the soundtrack to life. This wailing sound, tested and then used for real, triggered an immediate Pavlovian response. You had to stop what you were doing, cooking dinner, reading a book, talking to your family, and head for shelter. These shelters became a part of the home. In Britain, many families had an Anderson shelter in their garden, a small structure of corrugated iron covered with earth. For those without gardens, there were public shelters or the reinforced Morrison shelter, which looked like a steel cage and was set up inside the house, often doubling as a dining table. People spent countless nights huddled in these cramped, damp spaces, listening to the drone of bombers and the crump of distant explosions. The London Underground stations became massive, unofficial dormitories, with thousands of people sleeping on the platforms. Kennington Station, for example, had bunks installed for over 8,000 people. This created a strange, subterranean community, a shared experience of fear and resilience. The war, for many civilians, wasn't fought on a battlefield. It was fought in their own basements and backyards, against an invisible enemy in the dark sky above. Yet, we still don't fully understand the long-term psychological toll. How many people suffered from undiagnosed PTSD for the rest of their lives due to the nightly bombings? Were there studies conducted at the time on the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation and anxiety on children? And what did they find? And what secrets are still held in the forgotten diaries and letters of the ARP wardens, who witnessed the private moments of fear and courage in their communities night after night? Number 22. How do you feed a nation when the ships stop coming? In the 1930s, countries like Britain relied heavily on imported food. Roughly 70% of the nation's food came from overseas, transported by a vast merchant navy. This dependence was a critical vulnerability. When war broke out, enemy submarines began to target these supply ships, creating a desperate need to make the country self-sufficient. The solution was a massive nationwide campaign to turn every spare patch of land into a source of food. This was the birth of the Victory Garden. The idea was promoted with an intensity we would today associate with a major advertising campaign. In Britain, the Ministry of Agriculture launched the Dig for Victory campaign in 1939. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture followed suit. Propaganda posters were everywhere with slogans like "Sow the seeds of victory" and "Our food is fighting." Lawns, flower beds, parks, and even the moat of the Tower of London were plowed up and planted with vegetables. It was a radical transformation of the landscape. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was framed as a vital part of the war effort. By growing your own food, you were freeing up space on ships for weapons and raw materials. You were directly fighting the enemy. Millions of people who had never gardened before were suddenly learning how to grow potatoes, cabbages, carrots, and onions. The government distributed pamphlets and radio programs, like the BBC's The Kitchen Front, offered advice on gardening and cooking with the limited ingredients available. Lord Woolton, the British Minister of Food, became a household name, promoting simple, vegetable-based recipes like the Woolton pie. The scale of this movement was staggering. By 1943, it's estimated that there were over 18 million Victory Gardens in the United States, producing up to 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the country. In Britain, around 1.4 million allotments produced a huge tonnage of food. This had a profound impact on daily life. It changed diets, forcing people to eat more vegetables and less meat. It created new communities as neighbors shared tools, seeds, and advice. It gave people a sense of purpose and control at a time when so much felt chaotic. Tending to your garden was a small but tangible way to contribute. It connected the home front directly to the battlefront, but the full story is still unknown. How much did this nationwide gardening effort actually impact the nutritional health of the population? And were there official studies tracking this in real time? How many unique heirloom seed varieties were lost forever as the government pushed for the cultivation of a few hardy, high-yield crops like potatoes and leeks? And did the widespread use of new chemical pesticides in these gardens, encouraged for maximizing yield, have unforeseen environmental or health consequences that were never documented? Number 21. What if every letter you wrote was read by a stranger? Communication is a fundamental human need, especially during a time of crisis and separation. During the war, with millions of men and women serving overseas, the letter was the primary lifeline between the front lines and the home front. It was a connection to normalcy, a source of comfort, and a way to share news, but every single one of these millions of letters was subject to censorship. This created a strange and subtle tension in the most personal form of communication. The reason for censorship was national security. Governments were terrified that an accidental mention of a location, a troop movement, or even low morale could be intercepted by the enemy and used against them. To prevent this, massive censorship operations were established. In the United States, the Office of Censorship was created just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. It eventually employed over 10,000 people who read mail, cables, and listened in on international phone calls. In Britain, the Ministry of Information handled a similar task. For a soldier in the field, the process was direct. An officer in their unit would read their letters before they were sent. They would literally take a razor or scissors and cut out any offending phrases or sentences. The letter would arrive at home with noticeable gaps, a physical reminder of the censor's presence. For mail going the other way, from home to the front, and for all international mail, the process was more centralized. Letters would be opened, read, and, if necessary, redacted with black ink or cut up. The censors looked for specific keywords related to military matters, but also for anything that might damage morale. Overly pessimistic or defeatist language could be removed. This had a chilling effect on what people felt they could write. You learned to self-censor. You wrote in generalities, you talked about the weather, your health, and your love for the person you were writing to, but you avoided the specifics of your daily fear or the details of your work. It created a strange, stilted form of communication. The real, raw experiences of the war were often hidden between the lines or left out entirely. People developed simple codes not to share secrets, but to convey feelings. A certain sign-off might mean I'm safe, while another might mean I'm scared. The Diary of a Young Woman Named Anne Frank, written in hiding, is a powerful example of uncensored writing from the period, which is why it remains so shocking and immediate. It contains the kind of fear and detail that would never have made it past a censor. This massive invasion of privacy was largely accepted as a necessary evil. People understood the stakes, but it fundamentally changed the nature of personal communication. It placed a barrier between loved ones at the most critical time. The government was a silent third party in every conversation, but what remains unknown is the human cost for the censors themselves. What was the psychological impact of reading thousands of letters filled with fear, grief, and loneliness every single day? Were there any official records of censors who broke down or couldn't handle the emotional burden? And how many acts of quiet rebellion occurred, where a sympathetic censor let a forbidden but harmless phrase slip through, knowing it would bring comfort to a family back home? Number 20. How did the government get inside your head? Propaganda wasn't a new invention, but the Second World War took it to an unprecedented level of sophistication and saturation. It wasn't just about rallying support for the war, it was about shaping the thoughts and behaviors of every single citizen on a daily basis. And governments on all sides of the conflict established massive agencies to control the flow of information and craft powerful emotional messages. This was psychological warfare waged on the home front. In the United States, the Office of War Information, OWI, created in 1942, was the central hub. In Britain, it was the Ministry of Information, MOI. These organizations used every medium available. The poster was one of the most visible tools. Images were stark and direct. You had heroic soldiers, determined factory workers, and sinister enemy caricatures. Slogans were simple and memorable. Loose lips sink ships, keep calm and carry on, a British poster that was printed but rarely used at the time, only becoming famous decades later, and we can do it, featuring the image that would later be associated with Rosie the Riveter. These posters were plastered on every public surface in factories, post offices, and on billboards. They were a constant visual reinforcement of the national message. Film was another powerful weapon. Hollywood was enlisted in the effort. Major directors like Frank Capra produced the Why We Fight series, a set of documentary films explicitly designed to convince American soldiers and civilians of the necessity of the war. Fictional films also carried the message. Movies featured heroic soldiers, brave nurses, and plucky homefront families doing their part. The enemy was almost always portrayed as a one-dimensional, brutal villain. Newsreels, shown before every feature film, presented a carefully curated version of the war, emphasizing victories and downplaying losses. The radio was perhaps the most intimate medium. Presidents and prime ministers spoke directly to the public in their homes. Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats in the US and Winston Churchill's powerful speeches in Britain were masterclasses in public persuasion. They used radio to build a sense of national unity and resolve. Beyond these speeches, radio programming was filled with patriotic dramas, music, and messages. Even comic books got involved. Characters like Captain America, who first appeared in March 1941, were shown fighting the nation's enemies. This constant stream of messaging had a profound effect on daily life. It created a powerful us versus them mentality. It defined what it meant to be a good citizen. You saved your scrap metal, you bought war bonds, you didn't complain. It also fostered a climate of suspicion. The careless talk posters made people wary of what they said in public. The propaganda was so pervasive that it became the lens through which people understood the war. It was the official story, and there were few alternative sources of information. But there are still chilling questions. What psychological research did these government agencies conduct on their own populations to determine which images and words would be most effective at manipulating emotions? How much information about military disasters and friendly fire incidents was deliberately suppressed? And does that information still exist in classified archives? And how many people privately disagreed with the war or the government's portrayal of it, but were too afraid to speak out due to the overwhelming pressure of the propaganda machine? In number 19, could your kitchen grease help win the war? The war was a machine, and it was hungry for materials. Not just steel for ships and rubber for tires, but for everything. The scale of industrial production was unlike anything the world had ever seen, and it created massive shortages. To feed this machine, governments turned to the public, launching massive recycling and salvage campaigns that transformed household trash into vital war resources. This daily life became a continuous process of sorting and saving. It started with metal. Scrap drives were organized in almost every community. People were told that an old shovel could become part of a rifle, a rusty bed frame could be used in a tank. The campaigns were emotionally charged. Posters showed children pulling wagons piled high with pots and pans. In a famous 1942 campaign in the United States, actress Rita Hayworth even donated the steel bumpers from her car. People scoured their homes, attics, and basements for any scrap of iron, steel, aluminum, or copper. In public parks tore down iron fences. Towns donated old cannons from Civil War memorials. It was a nationwide treasure hunt for war material. The drive for rubber was even more desperate, especially for the United States after Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia cut off the primary source of natural rubber. The government instituted gasoline rationing to reduce tire wear and launched a massive victory rubber drive. People donated old tires, hot water bottles, rubber boots, and garden hoses. A national speed limit of 35 miles per hour was introduced not primarily for safety, but to conserve tires. Driving your car became a luxury, and for many, an unpatriotic one. But the campaigns went even further, into the most intimate parts of the home. One of the most unusual drives was for kitchen fat and grease. Housewives were given tins and told to save every drop of bacon grease, cooking oil, and meat drippings. This wasn't for food. Glycerin, a key component in these fats, was essential for making explosives like nitroglycerin. It was a startlingly direct connection. The leftovers from your family's dinner could be turned into munitions. Propaganda posters made the link clear, stating that a certain amount of saved fat could produce a certain number of bullets. Even silk and nylon stockings were collected. These materials were vital for making parachutes. Women would drop off their used, torn stockings at collection points in department stores. It was a small sacrifice, but it was part of a larger collective effort. These drives were more than just a practical way to gather resources. They were a powerful tool for morale. They gave everyone, including children and the elderly, a direct, tangible way to participate in the war effort. Sorting your trash wasn't just a chore, it was a patriotic duty. It made the war personal and immediate. But what don't we know about these massive efforts? How much of the collected material was actually usable for war production? And how much was simply a morale-boosting exercise that ended up in a landfill? Were there secret government reports that calculated the propaganda value of the drives versus their actual material contribution? And how many priceless historical artifacts, from old farm equipment to metal sculptures, were melted down and lost forever in the name of the scrap drive? Number 18. How does a country pay for a war that costs more than its entire economy? A war is fantastically expensive. The cost of building tanks, planes, and ships, and paying, feeding, and equipping millions of soldiers is astronomical. In the Second World War, the costs reached levels that were previously unimaginable. The U.S. government, for example, spent more than $300 billion on the war, which was more than it had spent in its entire history up to that point. How could any country afford this? The answer was to borrow money, not from banks, but directly from its own citizens. This was the age of the war bond. War bonds were essentially loans from citizens to the government. You would buy a bond for a certain price, say $18.75, and after a set number of years, you could redeem it for a higher value, like $25. The government got the cash it needed immediately, and the citizen got a safe investment that would pay off in the future. But these bonds were sold not as a financial product, but as an act of profound patriotism. The campaigns to sell them were relentless and used every tool of modern persuasion. The government enlisted Hollywood stars to lead bond drives. Celebrities like Bing Crosby, Bette Davis, and Clark Gable toured the country, holding massive rallies that were part entertainment, part sales pitch. The Third War Loan Drive in 1943 alone raised over $18 billion. Posters and advertisements were everywhere, linking the purchase of a bond directly to the safety of a soldier. One famous poster showed a father and son with the text, "I'm buying a share in victory. Are you?" The message was clear: if you weren't buying bonds, you weren't supporting the troops. The pressure to buy was immense. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. In factories, workers were encouraged to sign up for payroll deduction plans, where a portion of their weekly salary automatically went to buying bonds. The schools ran stamps for bonds programs, where children could buy 10-cent stamps to paste into a book. Once the book was full, it could be exchanged for a bond. This enlisted children in the effort and put pressure on their parents. In many communities, lists were published of who had and hadn't bought bonds. Not participating could lead to being publicly shamed or seen as unpatriotic. The war bond drives were incredibly successful. In the United States, over 85 million Americans, more than half the population in the nation, purchased bonds. It was a massive financial undertaking that did two things. First, it provided the government with a huge source of funding. Second, by taking money out of the hands of consumers, it helped to control inflation at a time when there were lots of jobs but very few things to buy. It was a brilliant piece of economic and social engineering. Buying a bond became one of the central rituals of life on the home front, a regular financial expression of support for the war. But there are lingering questions about this immense financial effort. How much social coercion was really involved? And are there records of people who lost their jobs or were ostracized for refusing to buy bonds? Did the government track the long-term financial impact on poor families who may have been pressured into investing money they couldn't really afford to lose? And what happened to the billions of dollars in unclaimed bonds after the war? And where did that money ultimately go? Number 17, can a war give birth to a new generation? Before the 1940s, the concept of a teenager as a distinct social group with its own culture, music, and style didn't really exist. You were a child, and then you were a young adult preparing for work or marriage. The war, in a strange and unexpected way, created the conditions for the modern teenager to emerge. It was a combination of economic changes, social disruption, and a new sense of identity. The first factor was money. The war economy created a massive labor shortage. With so many men away at war, older teenagers were pulled into the workforce. They took jobs in factories, on farms, and in shops. For the first time, a large number of young people had their own disposable income. They weren't just getting an allowance, they were earning a real wage. And because there wasn't much to spend it on cars, new clothes, and other consumer goods were scarce, so that money was funneled into entertainment. This new economic power created a market specifically for young people. They spent their money on movies, dance halls, and magazines. And most importantly, on music. This was the era of the bobby soxer, a term for teenage girls who wore bobby socks and were famously devoted to singers like Frank Sinatra. The scenes of young girls screaming and fainting at Sinatra's concerts in the early 1940s were a new social phenomenon. It was the birth of modern celebrity worship and youth-driven pop culture. This music and style gave teenagers a sense of collective identity, separate from their parents and the adult world. The second factor was a lack of supervision. With fathers overseas and mothers often working long hours in war industries, teenagers had more freedom and independence than any previous generation. They were less supervised at home and at school. This led to a rise in what was then called juvenile delinquency. Government officials and social commentators, like the famous FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, worried about roaming gangs of teenagers and rising crime rates. While some of these fears were exaggerated, they reflected a real social shift. Young people were creating their own social spaces and rules, often in defiance of adult authority. The war itself provided a backdrop of intense adult drama that made childhood seem distant. Teenagers were old enough to understand the gravity of the war, but too young to fight. This created a unique psychological space for them. They were in a hurry to grow up. Young couples got married quickly before the boy was shipped overseas. The world felt uncertain, and the future was a question mark. This life for today attitude fueled the new youth culture. The teenager was born out of this strange mix of economic empowerment, parental absence, and the psychological pressure of a world at war. But what parts of this story have been forgotten? How many teenage girls dropped out of school to work in factories, sacrificing their education, and were their stories ever properly recorded? Were the government's concerns about juvenile delinquency used as a cover to crack down on youth movements or social groups that were seen as undesirable? And how did the experience of being a teenager during the war shaped the generation that would go on to lead the social revolutions of the 1960s. Number 16, what happens when the government becomes the biggest boss? In the 1930s, particularly in democracies like the US and Britain, the role of the central government in the daily life of the average person was relatively small. Most people's interaction with the federal government might be limited to the post office. The war changed this completely and permanently. To manage a total war effort, governments had to take control of the national economy and exert an unprecedented level of authority over industries and individuals. The modern, powerful, bureaucratic state was forged in the fires of this conflict. The first and most dramatic change was in economic control. In a free market economy, businesses decide what to produce based on consumer demand. During the war, that was no longer possible. The needs of the military came first. Governments created a dizzying array of new agencies to manage this transition. In the United States, the War Production Board, WPB, established in 1942, was given immense power. It told companies like Ford and General Motors to stop making cars for civilians and start making tanks and bombers instead. The WPB allocated raw materials like steel, copper, and aluminum, deciding which industries got them and in what quantities. A company that made refrigerators might be ordered to start producing machine gun parts. The government became the primary customer and the ultimate boss of American industry. This level of control extended to prices and wages. With factories running 24/7 and full employment, there was a risk of runaway inflation, too much money chasing too few goods. To combat this, the Office of Price Administration, OPA, was created in the US. It had the power to freeze prices on almost everything, from a loaf of bread to a month's rent. It also had a role in controlling wages. In Britain, the Ministry of Supply had similar sweeping powers over the economy. This was a radical departure from pre-war capitalism. The government was now micromanaging the economy in a way that would have been considered unthinkable just a few years earlier. This new, powerful government also reached directly into people's lives. It was the government that issued your ration book, telling you how much sugar and meat you could buy. It was the government that might conscript you into the army or direct you to work in a specific factory through agencies like the War Manpower Commission. It was the government that censored your mail and filled your newspapers with propaganda. The size of the federal workforce exploded. In the US, the number of civilian employees in the executive branch nearly quadrupled, from about 1 million in 1940 to almost 3.8 million in 1945. This created a fundamental shift in the relationship between the citizen and the state. People became accustomed to a higher level of government intervention in their lives. After the war, many of these emergency powers were rolled back, but the government never returned to its pre-war size or scope. The expectation that the government had a role to play in managing the economy, providing social safety nets, and ensuring national security was now deeply ingrained. The massive bureaucratic state that we know today is, in many ways, a direct legacy of the war, but there are still unanswered questions about this massive expansion of power. How much corruption and corporate profiteering occurred under the cover of these massive government contracts, and which companies secretly benefited the most? Were there internal government debates about the long-term dangers of creating such a powerful state, and were those who raised concerns silenced? And how many of the temporary wartime surveillance and control measures secretly became permanent fixtures of government power? Number 15, could a can of meat change how we eat forever? Before the war, the American and European diet was largely based on fresh, locally sourced food. People bought meat from a butcher, vegetables from a grocer or their own garden, and milk was delivered in glass bottles. The concept of convenience food was in its infancy. The war, with its need to feed millions of soldiers across the globe, acted as a massive accelerator for the science of food processing and preservation. The way the world eats was fundamentally and permanently altered. The central problem was logistics. How do you ship nutritious, calorie-dense food that won't spoil to troops in the Pacific Islands or the deserts of North Africa? The answer was industrial-scale canning, dehydration, and innovation. The military became the biggest customer for the food industry, and it demanded products with a long shelf life. This led to the rise of iconic wartime foods. Spam, a canned meat product introduced by Hormel Foods in 1937, became legendary. The U.S. Army bought over 150 million pounds of it. It was easy to ship, required no refrigeration, and provided a reliable source of protein. Soldiers joked about it and complained about it, but it fed them. Dehydration was another key technology. Companies perfected methods for making powdered milk, powdered eggs, and powdered potatoes. These products were much lighter and more compact than their fresh counterparts, making them ideal for shipping. The taste was often poor, but they provided essential nutrients. The famous K ration, a daily ration for combat troops developed by the physiologist Ansel Keys, was a masterpiece of food engineering. It contained a mix of canned meats, biscuits, a chocolate bar, and instant coffee, all designed to deliver a specific number of calories in a compact package. These innovations weren't limited to military rations. The home front also saw changes. With rationing of fresh meat, sugar, and butter, people turned to processed alternatives. The science that went into military food found its way into civilian products. For instance, the M&M candy was created during this period. The hard candy shell prevented the chocolate from melting, making it an ideal treat to include in soldiers' rations. The patent was granted in 1941. Similarly, the process for making concentrated frozen orange juice was perfected during the war as a way to get vitamin C to troops. When the soldiers came home, they brought their new tastes and habits with them. They were accustomed to foods that were quick, easy, and required little preparation. The food industry, which had built up a massive infrastructure to supply the military, pivoted to this new consumer market. The post-war years saw the explosion of the supermarket, filled with canned goods, frozen foods, and cake mixes. The TV dinner, introduced in the 1950s, was the direct descendant of the prepackaged military meal. The war effectively trained a generation of consumers to value convenience over freshness, a shift that continues to dominate the global food industry to this day. But there are still mysteries in this culinary revolution. What unlisted chemical preservatives and additives were tested in military rations, and were there any long-term health studies on the soldiers who consumed them for years? How many small, local food producers were driven out of business by the dominance of the large corporations that received massive government contracts? And were soldiers' food preferences and psychological responses to different rations secretly studied by the military to design more effective post-war consumer products? Number 14. What happens to a family when the father disappears? The family is the basic unit of society. You know, in the pre-war era, it was typically a patriarchal structure, with the father as the primary breadwinner and authority figure, and the mother as the homemaker. The war ripped this structure apart on an unprecedented scale. Millions of fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons were conscripted and sent thousands of miles away, often for years at a time. This mass separation had a profound and lasting impact on family life, child rearing, and the roles of men and women. For the women left behind, life was turned upside down. They suddenly became single parents, responsible not only for raising children, but also for managing the household finances and making all the major decisions. This was a huge and often stressful new role. On top of this, as we've seen, many of these women also entered the workforce for the first time, adding the role of breadwinner to their duties. The traditional family model was effectively suspended for the duration of the war. The impact on children was complex and varied. For young children, the absence of a father created a void. Their primary memory of their father might be a photograph on the mantelpiece. They grew up in a world dominated by women mothers, aunts, grandmothers, and female teachers. This led to the rise of the latchkey kid, a child who came home from school to an empty house because their mother was at work. While neighbors and extended family often stepped in, this lack of parental supervision was a new phenomenon and a source of social anxiety. The government and private organizations tried to respond by opening the first large-scale daycare centers, a major social innovation born of necessity. The Lanham Act of 1940 in the U.S., for example, provided federal funds for the creation of childcare centers in communities with defense industries. The return of the fathers after the war was not the simple, happy reunion often depicted in movies. It was a difficult period of readjustment. The men who came back were often changed by their experiences, sometimes suffering from physical wounds or the invisible scars of psychological trauma, then often referred to as shell shock or combat fatigue. The family they returned to had also changed. The children had grown and barely knew them. The women had become more independent and self-reliant. A man who had been a figure of authority in the army might come home to find his wife was now in charge. This clash of expectations created immense tension in many families and contributed to a post-war spike in the divorce rate. The war fundamentally renegotiated the roles and power dynamics within the family, and the aftershocks were felt for decades. But what do we still not know about this immense social disruption? How many children suffered from long-term emotional or developmental problems due to paternal absence? And was this ever systematically studied at the time? Are there hidden government archives detailing the true extent of domestic conflict and divorce among returning soldiers and their families? And what were the secret personal stories of the women who, after years of newfound independence, had to give up their jobs and return to a purely domestic role when the men came home? Number 13. How did a global war shrink the world? Before the war, the world felt much larger. For the average person in America or Europe, news from Asia or Africa was distant and abstract. International travel was a luxury for the very rich. Most people lived and died within a few hundred miles of where they were born. The war changed this forever. It was a truly global conflict, and it created a new and powerful sense of global interconnectedness driven by technology and the shared experience of the war itself. The most immediate change was in the movement of people. The war precipitated one of the largest mass migrations in human history. 16 million Americans served in the armed forces, and millions of them were sent to places they had only read about in geography books: the islands of the Pacific, the fields of France, the deserts of North Africa. They came into contact with different cultures, languages, and peoples on a massive scale. This experience broadened their horizons and broke down their sense of isolation. When they returned home, they brought with them a new, more global perspective. This was also true on the home front. People were forced to think globally. The headlines in the daily newspaper were about battles in places like Stalingrad, El Alamein, or Midway. People followed the progress of the war on maps pinned to their kitchen walls. The radio was the key technology that brought the war into the living room. Foreign correspondents like Edward R. Murrow of CBS broadcasted live from London during the Blitz. His famous opening, "This is London," brought the reality of the bombing raids directly to American listeners. For the first time, people could hear the sounds of a distant battle in near real time. This created an emotional connection to global events that had never existed before. The war also accelerated technological developments that would shrink the world permanently. Aviation made a quantum leap. Long-range bombers developed during the war, like the B-29, laid the groundwork for the post-war era of international air travel. The war also spurred the development of radar, radio communication, and cryptography, all technologies that relied on a global network. The very act of coordinating a global war across multiple continents required a new level of international cooperation and communication among the Allied powers. This new global consciousness had profound political consequences. The experience of fighting a world war against ideologies of racial supremacy and national aggression led to the idea of creating international bodies to prevent future conflicts. This thinking led directly to the formation of the United Nations in 1945. The old ideas of isolationism, particularly strong in the United States before the war, were largely discredited. The war had taught a brutal lesson: what happened on the other side of the world could have a direct and devastating impact on your own country. The world was no longer a collection of distant continents. It was a single, interconnected, and dangerous neighborhood. But what are the hidden dimensions of this new globalism? How did the massive presence of American soldiers in countries like Britain and Australia lead to social friction and cultural clashes that were never reported in the official news? Were there secret agreements made between Allied leaders about how the world would be carved up after the war, long before the fighting was over? And what was the true unrecorded experience of non-Western peoples who were suddenly caught in the middle of a conflict between foreign empires fighting on their land? Number 12. Can you fight a war without moving? The image of war is one of movement: soldiers marching, tanks rolling, ships sailing. But for millions of people, the war also triggered a massive internal migration. People moved not to fight, but to work. The war effort required a concentration of labor in specific areas, cities with shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants. This led to one of the largest and most rapid internal population shifts in modern history, transforming the social and demographic landscape of nations like the United States. Before the war, the U.S. was still a largely rural and regional country. Many people, particularly in the South and Midwest, had never traveled far from their hometowns. The war changed that. The federal government poured billions of dollars into defense contracts, and these were concentrated in new and existing industrial centers. The West Coast, in particular, saw an explosion of growth. Cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, and Seattle became hubs of the aircraft industry. The shipyards in places like Richmond, California, and Mobile, Alabama, grew almost overnight. This created an enormous demand for workers. To fill these jobs, people began to move. An estimated 15 million Americans relocated permanently during the war. African Americans migrated from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West in what is sometimes called the Second Great Migration. This was a continuation of a trend that started earlier, but the war accelerated it dramatically. They were seeking not only economic opportunity, but also an escape from the oppressive racial segregation of the Jim Crow South. Here, white workers from Appalachia and the Dust Bowl regions also packed up and moved to factory towns. This mass migration created immense social challenges. The boomtowns were completely overwhelmed. There were severe housing shortages. People lived in trailers, makeshift shacks, or crowded dormitories. Or schools and hospitals were swamped. The infrastructure couldn't keep up with the population explosion. This rapid influx of people from different regional, ethnic, and racial backgrounds into crowded urban spaces also created enormous social friction. Tensions between different groups boiled over into conflict. The Detroit race riot of 1943, which resulted in 34 deaths, was one of the most violent examples of these new social pressures. The Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles in the same year saw servicemen attacking young Mexican-American men. Despite these challenges, this migration permanently reshaped the country. It broke down regional isolation. It accelerated the process of urbanization. It created new diverse communities and laid the groundwork for the post-war civil rights movement as African Americans who had contributed to the war effort demanded equal rights. The war set the nation in motion, not just on the battlefield, but within its own borders. It was a social revolution driven by the demands of the factory. But what are the untold stories of this great migration? How many families were torn apart by the move or failed to adapt to their new, unfamiliar urban environments? Are there government records that detail the true extent of the housing crises and sanitation problems in these boomtowns? And how did the sudden influx of so many new workers change the power dynamics of labor unions and local politics in ways that are still being felt today? Number 11. What if a wonder drug changed the very nature of survival? In all previous wars in human history, soldiers were as likely to die from disease or infection as they were from an enemy's weapon. A simple wound from a bullet or shrapnel could easily become infected, leading to gangrene, amputation, and a slow, agonizing death. The Second World War was the first conflict in which medicine could offer a real defense against this invisible enemy. The key was a new wonder drug, penicillin. The antibacterial properties of the penicillium mold were first discovered by the Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming in 1928. But his discovery remained a scientific curiosity for over a decade. It was difficult to produce in large quantities and purify for medical use. The outbreak of the war provided a massive impetus to solve this problem. A team of scientists at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, picked up Fleming's research in the late 1930s. They demonstrated that a purified form of penicillin could be a powerful weapon against bacterial infections. With Britain under siege, they realized they couldn't produce it on the scale needed. In 1941, Florey traveled to the United States to seek help. The U.S. government, recognizing the immense military potential of the drug, launched a massive coordinated effort to mass produce it. They enlisted major pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Merck and university research labs. It was a project on the scale of the effort to build the atomic bomb. Scientists worked feverishly to find better strains of the mold. One of the most productive was famously found on a cantaloupe in a market in Peoria, Illinois, and to develop deep tank fermentation methods for industrial scale production. By 1943, they had succeeded. Penicillin was being produced in vast quantities, but it was considered so valuable that it was reserved almost exclusively for military use. The impact on the battlefield was revolutionary. Medics could now treat infections that would have been a death sentence just a few years earlier. The death rate from bacterial pneumonia among soldiers plummeted. The number of amputations due to infected wounds was drastically reduced. Penicillin, along with other medical advances like the use of blood plasma for transfusions and new surgical techniques, fundamentally changed the odds of survival for a wounded soldier. It's been estimated that the introduction of penicillin saved hundreds of thousands of lives during the war. The drug also had a profound impact on the home front, though it was much harder to come by for civilians until after the war. It was a symbol of the power of modern science and a source of hope. Newspapers and magazines ran stories about this miraculous new drug that could cure deadly diseases. The war, for all its destruction, had accelerated a medical revolution. After the war, penicillin became widely available to the public, launching the modern age of antibiotics and transforming the practice of medicine forever. But there are still unanswered questions about this medical breakthrough. Were there secret human trials of early unpurified forms of penicillin conducted on soldiers or civilians, and what were the results? How many people on the home front died from infections that could have been cured by the penicillin that was being reserved for the military? And did the widespread use of the drug in the military lead to the development of the first penicillin-resistant bacteria, a problem that plagues medicine to this day? Number 10. How did the war create an invisible enemy at home? The Second World War was not just fought against external enemies. For certain groups of citizens within the Allied nations, the war brought suspicion, hostility, and the stripping away of their civil rights. The fear of espionage and sabotage, fanned by propaganda and pre-existing prejudice, led governments to turn against their own people. The most egregious example of this in the United States was the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. Before the war, there was a long history of anti-Asian racism on the West Coast. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, these long-simmering prejudices erupted into open hysteria. Politicians, military leaders, and newspaper columnists claimed, without any evidence, that the Japanese American community posed a threat to national security. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, the head of the Western Defense Command, famously stated, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the military to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. Though the order did not mention any specific ethnicity, it was applied almost exclusively to Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Around 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, were forced to leave their homes. They were given just days to sell their property, businesses, and possessions, often at a devastating loss. They were first sent to temporary assembly centers, often racetracks or fairgrounds, where they lived in hastily converted horse stalls. From there, they were transported to 10 remote, desolate relocation centers, a government euphemism for concentration camps in states like California, Utah, and Arkansas. These camps were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Families lived in cramped, poorly insulated barracks. They endured harsh weather, inadequate food, and the profound psychological trauma of being imprisoned by their own country. Despite this, many young Japanese American men volunteered to fight for the United States, serving with incredible distinction in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. This mass incarceration was a profound betrayal of American ideals. It was not based on any evidence of disloyalty. In fact, a secret government report, known as the Munson Report, submitted just before Pearl Harbor, had concluded that Japanese Americans posed no threat. The decision was driven by what a later congressional commission called race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It was a stark reminder that the pressures of war could lead a democratic nation to abandon its own principles. Similar, though less extensive, actions were taken against citizens of German and Italian descent, but the scale and racial basis of the Japanese American internment was unique. But many questions still haunt this dark chapter. How many government officials privately knew that the internment was unnecessary and unconstitutional but remained silent? What is the full, unrecorded economic loss suffered by the families who had their property and businesses stolen or sold for pennies on the dollar? And are there still classified documents that reveal the true extent of the government's surveillance and infiltration of these ethnic communities before, during, and after the war? Number 9. What if a top-secret machine changed the way we think? While the war was being fought with tanks and planes, a secret, intellectual war was being waged by mathematicians, linguists, and engineers. This was the war of code breaking, and the effort to crack the complex communication codes of the enemy would lead to the development of a machine that would define the modern world, the electronic computer. Military communication relies on codes, or ciphers, to protect messages from the enemy. The German military had developed a highly sophisticated cipher machine called Enigma. It looked like a typewriter, but it used a series of rotating wheels and an electrical plug board to scramble messages into a seemingly unbreakable code. Cracking this code was one of the highest priorities for the Allies, as it would give them access to the enemy's most secret plans. The center of the British code-breaking effort was a top-secret facility at a country estate called Bletchley Park. Here, a brilliant and eccentric group of academics was assembled. Among them was the mathematician Alan Turing, a man now considered one of the fathers of computer science. Turing and his colleagues realized that the Enigma code was too complex to be broken by hand. The number of possible settings for the machine was astronomical. They needed a machine to fight a machine. Building on earlier work by Polish cryptanalysts, the team at Bletchley Park developed a series of electromechanical devices called bombs. These machines were not computers in the modern sense, but they were designed to rapidly test thousands of possible Enigma settings, looking for logical contradictions that would reveal the correct key for the day. The whirring and clicking of these machines, which were over 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide, was the sound of the secret war. The intelligence gained from this operation, codenamed Ultra, was invaluable. It helped the Allies win the Battle of the Atlantic by tracking submarine movements, and it provided crucial information for campaigns like the D-Day landings. But the Enigma was not the only challenge. The German High Command used an even more complex machine, the Lorenz cipher, for its most sensitive communications. To break this code, an engineer named Tommy Flowers and his team at the Post Office Research Station designed and built Colossus. Unveiled in 1944, Colossus is now regarded by many as the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. It used thousands of vacuum tubes and was able to perform calculations at a speed that was previously unimaginable. It was used to decipher the Lorenz messages, giving Allied leaders, including Dwight D. Eisenhower, unprecedented insight into the enemy's strategy. The work at Bletchley Park was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The existence of Colossus and the Ultra Project was not declassified until decades later. The men and women who worked there were sworn to secrecy for life, but their work had a profound legacy. The ideas and technologies developed to break these codes, the use of electronics for calculation, the concepts of programmability and logical processing, were the direct precursors to the digital computers that now power our world. The smartphone in your pocket has a direct ancestor in a top-secret, room-sized machine built to win a war. But what secrets about this intellectual arms race are still hidden? Were there other, less successful code-breaking projects that have never been declassified? How many military operations went wrong? Because the intelligence from Bletchley Park was misinterpreted or arrived too late. And what was the true personal toll on figures like Alan Turing, whose immense contribution to victory was kept secret while he faced persecution for his personal life after the war? Number 8. How did a global conflict ignite a struggle for freedom at home? The Second World War was framed by Allied leaders as a fight for freedom and democracy against tyranny and racial supremacy. This official narrative created a stark and uncomfortable contradiction for African Americans. They were being asked to fight and die for freedoms abroad that they were systematically denied at home. This hypocrisy fueled a new sense of urgency and activism, leading to the WWII campaign victory against the enemy abroad and victory against racism at home. When the war began, the American military was completely segregated. African American soldiers served in separate, often poorly equipped units, usually relegated to support roles rather than combat. On the home front, they faced discrimination in the booming defense industries, which often refused to hire them or offered only the most menial jobs. The Red Cross even segregated donated blood plasma. This was the reality of the Jim Crow era. The black press, particularly newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, became a powerful voice for change. In a letter to the editor published in February 1942, James G. Thompson of Wichita, Kansas, called for a double V for a double victory. The Courier embraced the idea, and the WWII campaign was born. It became a rallying cry for Black Americans across the country. It was a way to express their patriotism while simultaneously demanding their full civil rights. It was a powerful message that linked the global struggle against fascism with the domestic struggle against racial injustice. This new activism took many forms. Philip Randolph, a prominent labor leader, planned a massive march on Washington in 1941 to protest discrimination in the defense industry. The threat of 100,000 African Americans marching on the Capitol was so potent that President Roosevelt relented. He issued Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in the defense industry and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee (FEP) to investigate complaints. It was a landmark victory, the first major federal action against employment discrimination since the Reconstruction era. The war experience itself was a catalyst for change. Over 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces. For many, it was their first time outside the segregated South. Serving in Europe, they saw a society that, while not free of prejudice, did not have the same rigid, institutionalized segregation as America. They fought alongside white soldiers and proved their courage and capability in combat, particularly in segregated units like the Tuskegee Airmen. When these veterans returned home, they were less willing to accept the indignities of second-class citizenship. They had fought for their country, and now they demanded that their country live up to its ideals. This generation of veterans, empowered and organized, would form the backbone of the civil rights movement that would explode in the following decades. The war, in its profound irony, had sown the seeds of America's next great social revolution. But what parts of this struggle have been erased from the official history? How many acts of resistance and protest by black soldiers against discrimination within the military were brutally suppressed and covered up? Are there still classified FEPC reports that detail the true shocking extent of racism in the wartime industries? And how did the government's own propaganda, which celebrated freedom and equality, secretly fuel the very movement that would challenge its own domestic policies? Number 7. How do you entertain a world in turmoil? During a time of total war, with its constant stress, rationing, and fear, the need for escapism and entertainment becomes more intense than ever. The war years saw a boom in the entertainment industry, but it was an industry transformed by the conflict. Movies, music, and live performances all became part of the war effort, serving as tools for boosting morale, spreading propaganda, and providing a much-needed distraction from the grim realities of daily life. Hollywood went to war. The major studios worked closely with the government's Office of War Information to produce films that supported the national cause. This resulted in a flood of war-themed movies. There were combat films that celebrated the heroism of American soldiers like Bataan 1943. There were homefront dramas that showed families doing their part, like Mrs. Miniver 1942, a film so powerful that Winston Churchill claimed it was worth more than a fleet of battleships. There were also musicals and comedies that offered pure escapism, but even these often included a patriotic song or a scene where characters bought war bonds. Going to the movies was the primary form of entertainment, and for the price of a ticket, you could be transported away from the world of blackouts and ration books for a few hours. Music also played a vital role. The big band and swing music of the era was the soundtrack to the war. Artists like Glenn Miller, whose band was one of the most popular in the world, enlisted and took his music to the troops. The songs of the time reflected the national mood. There were patriotic anthems, but there were also sentimental ballads about separation and longing, like I'll Be Seeing You. Her music was a way to express the complex emotions of the period of pride, love, fear, and hope. The Armed Forces Radio Service broadcasted music and entertainment to soldiers all over the world, providing a comforting sound of home. Perhaps the most direct fusion of entertainment and the war effort was the United Service Organizations, or USO. Founded in 1941, the USO was a private, non-profit organization that provided recreation and entertainment to service members. They operated clubs where soldiers could get a meal, write a letter, or just relax. And they put on famous camp shows, bringing top entertainers to perform for troops, often in dangerous frontline conditions. The stars like Bob Hope and Marlene Dietrich traveled thousands of miles to perform for soldiers in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. These shows were a massive boost to morale, a tangible sign that the people back home had not forgotten them. But Bob Hope, in particular, became an icon for his tireless dedication to entertaining the troops. Entertainment during the war was never just entertainment. It was a crucial part of the national infrastructure of morale. It brought people together, gave them a shared cultural experience, and provided the psychological resilience needed to endure years of conflict and sacrifice. It was a reminder of what people were fighting for, a world where you could laugh at a comedy, dance to a song, or lose yourself in a story. But what was the hidden side of this wartime entertainment? How much censorship was involved in Hollywood films, with the government dictating plot points or character portrayals to fit the official narrative? What were the real unpublicized experiences of the female entertainers who traveled with the USO in combat zones? And how many musicians and artists with dissenting or pacifist views were blacklisted and had their careers ruined during this period of intense patriotic fervor? Number 6, what if the air you breathe was filled with a new kind of fear? The Second World War was an industrial war, but it was also a chemical war, not just in the use of explosives, but in the development and production of a vast array of new chemicals and materials that would change the world. The dark side of this was the ever-present fear of chemical weapons, like the mustard gas that had caused such horrific injuries in the First World War. This led to a strange and frightening addition to daily life, the gas mask. In countries like Britain, which were in direct range of enemy bombers, the government issued gas masks to every single man, woman, and child. Over 38 million were distributed. The gas mask became a grim but essential accessory. People were required by law to carry them at all times. They came in a cardboard box with a string to sling over your shoulder. The daily routine included checking your mask and practicing how to put it on quickly. In schools, ran regular gas mask drills for children. There were even special, brightly colored Mickey Mouse masks designed to make them less frightening for toddlers. The constant presence of the mask was a visceral, daily reminder of the potential for a new and silent form of death from the sky. Fortunately, gas was never used on a wide scale against civilian populations in Europe, but the fear was real and pervasive. This fear was part of a broader psychological shift. The war introduced a new level of anxiety into the environment itself. The air could be a threat. A distant sound could be an approaching bomber. This constant low-level stress had a corrosive effect on mental health. Beyond the fear of chemical attack, the war spurred a revolution in the chemical industry that had a more lasting impact. The need for new materials led to the rapid development of plastics. Before the war, plastics were a novelty. During the war, they became essential. They were used for everything from aircraft canopies, plexiglass, to insulation and radar equipment, polyethylene. The war also cut off supplies of natural resources like rubber and silk, forcing chemists to invent synthetic alternatives. This led to the mass production of synthetic rubber for tires and nylon for parachutes, ropes, and uniforms. The scientist Wallace Carothers at DuPont had invented nylon in the 1930s, but the war turned it into a massive industrial product. This chemical revolution had a direct impact on the home front. While new consumer goods were not available during the war, the materials were being created and perfected. The post-war world would be a world of plastic. The Tupperware, vinyl floors, and nylon clothing that filled the homes of the 1950s were all direct results of the chemical industry's wartime expansion. The war had created a new synthetic world, but the most sinister chemical project of the war was the development of the atomic bomb. This was the ultimate application of science to destruction. The Manhattan Project, a top-secret Allied program, brought together the world's top physicists to unlock the power of the atom. The successful test of the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert in July 1945, and its subsequent use, introduced a new and terrifying reality to the world. It was not just a bigger bomb, it was a weapon that could destroy entire cities and poison the environment with invisible radiation. The air itself was now potentially filled with a new, man-made, and persistent threat. The war ended with the dawn of the nuclear age, and with it, a new existential fear that would hang over humanity for the rest of the century. But what are the still classified secrets of this chemical war? Were there secret tests of chemical or biological agents on Allied troops or civilians to gauge their effectiveness? What is the full long-term environmental and health impact of the massive, unregulated chemical production that took place during the war? And what did the scientists of the Manhattan Project say to each other in private, unrecorded conversations about the moral implications of the weapon they were creating? Number 5. How did the world get its rhythm back? The end of the war was not a single event but a process. It was a slow, staggered return to a world without daily air raid sirens and casualty lists. But as the fighting stopped, a new massive social phenomenon began to take shape, one that would dramatically alter the demographic landscape for decades to come. This was the Bobby Boom. The reasons for the baby boom are complex. The most obvious factor was the return of millions of soldiers. Couples who had been separated for years were finally reunited. Marriages that had been postponed by the war could now take place. There was a powerful collective desire to return to a sense of normalcy, and for many, normalcy meant starting a family. The birth rate, which had been low during the Great Depression and the war years, began to skyrocket. In the United States, the birth rate jumped dramatically in 1946 and stayed high for nearly 2 decades. Between 1946 and 1964, the Bobby Boom generation was born, but the boom was also fueled by economic factors. The war had pulled countries like the United States out of the Great Depression. The post-war years were a period of unprecedented economic prosperity. The GI Bill, passed in the U.S. in 1944, was a transformative piece of legislation. It provided returning veterans with a range of benefits, including low-cost mortgages and money for college or vocational training. This allowed a whole generation of men to get an education, buy a home, and secure a stable, well-paying job. This economic security made it possible for young couples to afford to have larger families. This demographic explosion had a massive and immediate impact on society. It created an enormous demand for new housing. This led to the growth of the suburbs, as developers like William Levitt began to mass-produce affordable, single-family homes on the outskirts of cities. It created a huge market for consumer goods aimed at families' washing machines, refrigerators, televisions, and station wagons. The entire economy began to reorient itself around the needs of these new young families. As the baby boomers grew up, they continued to reshape society at every stage. They swamped the school systems in the 1950s, leading to a massive wave of school construction. In the 1960s, as they reached their teenage and college years, they fueled the youth culture and the social and political upheavals of that decade. Their sheer numbers gave them a cultural and political power that no previous generation had possessed. The world we live in today, our cities, our economy, our culture, was profoundly shaped by this demographic echo of the Second World War. It was the result of a world collectively deciding, after years of death and destruction, to embrace life. But what do we still not know about this great demographic shift? How much did government propaganda after the war actively encourage women to leave the workforce and embrace motherhood to make jobs available for returning soldiers? Were there secret government studies that predicted the long-term social and economic impacts of such a massive population bulge? And what were the hidden stories of the women who felt trapped by the immense social pressure to marry young and have children, sacrificing their own careers and ambitions in the process? Number 4. How did the war get inside our minds? The Second World War was a profoundly psychological event. It subjected millions of people, both soldiers and civilians, to levels of stress, fear, and trauma that were previously unimaginable. This collective trauma left deep and lasting scars, changing not only the individuals who experienced it, but also our very understanding of the human mind and its breaking points. For soldiers in combat, the psychological pressures were immense. The constant threat of death, the witnessing of horrific violence, and the loss of comrades took a terrible toll. The military began to recognize that many breakdowns were not due to cowardice or weakness, but were legitimate medical conditions. The term shell shock from the First World War was replaced by new terms like combat exhaustion or battle fatigue. The U.S. Army's chief psychiatrist William Menninger played a key role in advocating for a more compassionate and scientific approach. He pushed for treating psychological casualties closer to the front lines with the goal of returning them to duty. This was a pragmatic, military-driven approach, but it represented a significant step forward in acknowledging the reality of psychological injury. However, the understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was still in its infancy. Many veterans returned home with invisible wounds. They suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, depression, and an inability to readjust to civilian life. They were often told to get over it or be a man. They suffered in silence, and their trauma had a ripple effect on their families and communities for generations. The full extent of this psychological damage was not widely understood or discussed for decades. The psychological impact was not limited to soldiers. Civilians living under bombardment endured years of chronic stress. The nightly blackouts, the wail of the air raid sirens, the destruction of homes, and the constant fear had a profound effect, especially on children. Studies conducted in Britain during and after the war, like those by the psychoanalyst Anna Freud, looked at the impact of separating children from their parents during evacuations. They found that the separation itself was often more traumatic than the fear of the bombs. The war created a generation of people who grew up with a deep-seated sense of anxiety and insecurity. The conflict also forced a reckoning with the darker aspects of human nature. The systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of millions of innocent civilians by the German regime and its collaborators raised profound questions about morality, obedience to authority, and the capacity for evil. After the war, this led to new fields of psychological inquiry. Famous and controversial experiments in the 1950s and 60s, like the Milgram experiment on obedience and the Stanford Prison experiment, were direct attempts to understand how ordinary people could be brought to commit terrible acts. The war forced humanity to look into a dark mirror, and the reflection changed psychology forever. But what are the deepest, most hidden psychological scars of the war? How many suicides among veterans in the decades following the war were never officially linked to their combat experiences? Are there classified military medical records that show the true, staggering number of psychological breakdowns that occurred during major battles? And what was the unrecorded emotional impact on the scientists, politicians, and generals who made the decisions that led to the deaths of millions of people. Number 3. What if the key to the future was found in a moment of total crisis? The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human history, but out of that destruction came a wave of scientific and technological innovation that shaped the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The war acted as a giant, high-pressure accelerator. The urgent need to solve life or death problems forced governments to pour unprecedented resources into research and development. Scientists and engineers were pushed to their creative limits. The result was a series of breakthroughs that fundamentally changed daily life. We have already seen how the war gave us the computer, penicillin, and the atomic age, but the list goes on. The war effort required the development of radar, radio detection, and ranging to detect enemy aircraft and ships. This technology, perfected in labs like MIT's Radiation Laboratory, not only changed the course of the war, but also gave us the foundation for everything from air traffic control to the microwave oven in your kitchen. The key component, the cavity magnetron, was a British invention shared with the US. Jet engine technology was developed concurrently by engineers in both Germany and Britain. While jet fighters saw limited action at the very end of the war, the technology would revolutionize post-war aviation, leading to the age of fast global air travel. The war also saw the development of the first large-scale, liquid-fueled rockets. The German V-2 rocket, a weapon of terror used against cities like London, was a technological marvel. After the war, the scientists who built it, including Wernher von Braun, were brought to the United States. Their expertise became the foundation for the American space program, which would eventually put a man on the moon. The war's impact was felt in countless smaller, everyday technologies as well. The need for a reliable pen that wouldn't leak at high altitudes for bomber crews helped spur the development of the modern ballpoint pen. The need for a quick way to seal ammunition boxes led to the invention of a strong, waterproof cloth-back tape, what we now know as duct tape. The Slinky toy was invented by a naval engineer in 1943 when he accidentally knocked a torsion spring off a shelf and watched it walk. Even the common aerosol spray can has its roots in the bug bomb developed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to protect soldiers from insect-borne diseases in the Pacific. This immense technological leap was the result of what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex. It was a new, powerful partnership between government, industry, and science, all focused on a single goal. After the war, this partnership continued, fueling the Cold War arms race and further technological development. The war created a permanent expectation that large-scale, government-funded research could solve humanity's biggest problems. It was a legacy of both incredible progress and immense destructive power, a paradox born from a global crisis. But what technological secrets of the war are still unknown? Were there more radical or dangerous weapons systems that were developed but never used? And are their blueprints still locked in a vault? How many key inventions were made by individuals who were never credited, their ideas co-opted by larger government or corporate projects? And what was the true human cost of this rapid technological progress, measured in industrial accidents, environmental contamination, and the lives of the test pilots and soldiers who were the first to use these new, unproven technologies? Number 2. What happens when the world redefines? Wrong. The end of the war did not just mean the end of fighting. It meant a global reckoning. The sheer scale and nature of the atrocities committed during the conflict forced the world to confront fundamental questions of justice, human rights, and the responsibility of nations and individuals. This led to a series of historic trials and the creation of a new framework for international law that continues to shape our world. Before the war, the concept of sovereignty was paramount. What a nation did to its own people within its own borders was largely considered its own business. The idea of holding the leaders of a sovereign nation accountable in an international court for their actions was radical and unprecedented. But the horrors that were uncovered as Allied forces advanced through Europe, the discovery of the concentration and extermination camps, the evidence of mass murder and systematic persecution camp made the old rules seem inadequate. The result was the Nuremberg trials held from 1945 to 1946. For the first time, high-ranking political and military leaders of the German regime were put on trial by an international tribunal composed of judges from the Allied powers. They were charged not only with traditional war crimes, but with new categories of offense, crimes against peace, for planning and waging an aggressive war, and crimes against humanity. This last charge was a revolutionary legal concept. It established that certain actions like murder, extermination, and enslavement of a civilian population were crimes so heinous that they transcended the laws of any single nation. It meant that I was just following orders was no longer a valid legal defense. The trials were a massive undertaking. The prosecutors, led by figures like the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, presented mountains of evidence, including thousands of captured German documents and shocking film footage from the camps. The trials were a public and meticulous documentation of the brutality of the regime. They established a historical record that could not be denied. While some criticized the trials as victor's justice, they established a powerful precedent that individuals, no matter how powerful, can be held accountable for their actions on the world stage. The principles established at Nuremberg and at similar trials held in Tokyo for Japanese leaders became the foundation of modern international humanitarian law, and they led directly to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a document that, for the first time, set out the fundamental rights and freedoms to which all human beings are entitled. They also informed the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which established the rules for how civilians and prisoners of war should be treated during a conflict. The idea of human rights, something we now take for granted, was forged in the aftermath of a war that had shown a terrifying disregard for human life. It was an attempt to build a legal and moral firewall against the possibility of such a catastrophe ever happening again. But deep and troubling questions remain about this new era of justice. How many thousands of lower-ranking officials and ordinary individuals who participated in atrocities were never brought to trial and simply melted back into post-war society? Were there secret deals made by the Allies to protect certain individuals in exchange for scientific or intelligence information? And has the principle of international justice established at Nuremberg been applied equally to all nations since 1945, or has it remained a form of victor's justice, used selectively against the defeated and the weak? Number 1. Why did the world never feel safe again? The Second World War redrew the map of the world. It shattered empires, created new nations, and established a new global power structure. But its most profound and lasting legacy was not geopolitical, it was psychological. The war fundamentally and permanently altered humanity's sense of security. It introduced a new kind of fear into the world, a fear that has never fully gone away. Before the war, the world was dominated by the old European powers like Britain and France. By 1945, these nations were exhausted and economically shattered. The war had bled them dry and accelerated the end of their colonial empires. In their place, two new superpowers emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations had been allies in the war against the Axis powers, but their alliance was one of convenience. They had fundamentally different political and economic ideologies: capitalism and democracy versus communism and authoritarianism. As soon as their common enemy was defeated, their deep-seated mistrust and hostility rose to the surface. The world was almost immediately plunged into a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. It was not a hot war fought with armies on a battlefield, but a global struggle for influence, waged through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and an arms race. The Iron Curtain, in Winston Churchill's famous phrase from a 1946 speech, descended across Europe, dividing the continent into a democratic West and a communist East. For the next 4 decades, this division would define international politics and create a constant state of tension and fear. The most terrifying aspect of this new conflict was the nuclear arms race. The war had ended with the demonstration of the atomic bomb's terrifying power. The United States had a brief monopoly on this ultimate weapon, but the Soviet Union developed its own bomb in 1949. This began a frantic race to build more numerous and more powerful nuclear weapons. Both sides developed hydrogen bombs 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb used on Hiroshima. They built arsenals of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that could deliver these weapons to any city on the globe in under 30 minutes. This created a situation known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was that if either superpower launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate, and both nations would be completely destroyed. This terrifying balance of power prevented a direct war between the US and the user, but it meant that the entire world lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Children in American schools practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks in a futile exercise against a nuclear blast. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The war had unleashed a power that humanity could not control, and the fear of a world-ending apocalypse became a part of daily life. The sense of safety and optimism that existed before the war was gone, replaced by a permanent low-grade anxiety that defined the second half of the 20th century. The greatest conflict in history did not end with a lasting peace, but with a new, more terrifying kind of war. But what are the final unanswered questions from this world-changing conflict? What secret agreements were made between the Allied leaders at conferences like Yalta and Potsdam that set the stage for the Cold War, and have the full transcripts ever been released? How close did the world come to a nuclear exchange during the tense, unpublicized standoffs of the early Cold War? And after all the destruction, all the sacrifice, and all the loss, what was the most important lesson of the war that humanity has already forgotten?